The annual American Heritage Furniture Auction in Williamsburg, Virginia, attracted antique collectors, historians, museum curators, and master craftsmen from across the country. Among hundreds of beautifully restored pieces stood one simple wooden chair with faded oak, worn armrests, and decades of visible scratches. Many visitors walked past without giving it a second glance. Sitting quietly near the back of the auction hall was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded flannel shirt, old denim overalls, worn leather work boots, and carrying a weathered wooden toolbox instead of an expensive briefcase. Several collectors assumed he was simply a retired carpenter, curious about old furniture. One bidder laughed after looking at the chair. "Nobody's paying real money for that thing. It belongs in a firewood pile." The people around him chuckled. The elderly man only smiled and gently ran his hand across the chair's worn armrest, as though greeting an old friend. Moments before the auctioneer opened the bidding, the director of the National Heritage Museum hurried across the hall, stopped beside the old man, and warmly shook both of his hands. "Mr. Samuel Whitaker," he said with unmistakable respect, "we're honored you came." The room fell completely silent. Only then did the audience discover that the quiet carpenter sitting in the corner was the master craftsman who had built the humble chair more than 50 years earlier by special request for a president of the United States. Resting inside Samuel's weathered wooden toolbox were the original hand-drawn woodworking plans, carving tools polished by decades of use, and one sealed letter from the old cabinet maker who had taught him that a piece of furniture should never be judged by how expensive it looks, but by how faithfully it serves the person who sits in it. The exhibition hall in Williamsburg, Virginia, buzzed with excitement as collectors, museum curators, antique dealers, historians, and master furniture makers gathered for the annual American Heritage Furniture Auction. Hundreds of remarkable pieces filled the room. From hand-carved mahogany cabinets and colonial writing desks, to elegant rocking chairs and rare 18th-century dining tables, each item had been carefully restored, polished until it gleamed beneath the gallery lights, and accompanied by impressive certificates of authenticity. Near the far corner of the exhibition stood one object that attracted almost no attention. It was a simple oak chair with straight lines, worn armrests, polished smooth by decades of use, a slightly faded finish, and several small scratches that had never been repaired. Compared with the magnificent antiques surrounding it, the chair looked almost ordinary. Several visitors walked past without even reading its description. One collector glanced at it before shaking his head. "Who would spend money on something that plain?" Another laughed softly. "I've seen better chairs in old farmhouses." Sitting quietly on a wooden bench not far from the display was an 80-year-old man named Samuel Whitaker. He wore a faded red flannel shirt beneath well-worn denim overalls, sturdy leather work boots darkened by years of sawdust and wood stain, and a pair of round reading glasses. Resting beside him was a weathered wooden toolbox with brass corners polished by decades of careful use. Instead of studying the auction catalog, Samuel quietly watched visitors examine the furniture. Every so often, he smiled as someone admired a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, regardless of who had built it. A young antique dealer noticed the elderly man sitting alone and assumed he was simply another retired carpenter curious about the exhibition. "Beautiful furniture today," he said politely. Samuel nodded. "Very beautiful." The dealer pointed toward the old oak chair. "Not that one, though," he laughed. "That thing won't bring much." Samuel smiled gently without replying. A few moments later, a wealthy bidder wearing an expensive tailored suit stopped in front of the chair. He looked at the worn wood before speaking loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "Nobody pays serious money for a chair that looks like it belongs in a storage shed." Several people laughed. Samuel quietly lowered his eyes, gently brushing a tiny speck of dust from one sleeve of his old flannel shirt. Across the hall, the auction staff prepared for the afternoon's featured presentation. Elizabeth Morgan, director of the National Heritage Museum, reviewed the final list of featured artifacts before suddenly freezing. Her eyes stopped on a single name printed near the bottom of the attendance sheet. "Samuel Whitaker," she whispered. Looking around the crowded exhibition hall, she immediately spotted the elderly carpenter sitting quietly on the bench. Without hesitation, she walked directly toward him. Visitors stepped aside in confusion as the museum director approached the old man. Reaching him, Elizabeth smiled warmly before extending both hands. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "thank you for coming." Samuel chuckled softly. "I was hoping to sit quietly." Elizabeth laughed. I'm afraid that's impossible today. Turning toward the growing crowd, she raised her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced. Before today's auction begins, I'd like to introduce someone very special. The room gradually fell silent. Most of you have walked past the old oak chair in Gallery 3. She smiled toward Samuel. Very few of you know the man who built it. Historians exchanged puzzled looks. Several museum curators slowly stood straighter. Samuel looked almost embarrassed by the attention. Elizabeth continued. More than 50 years ago, that chair was handcrafted by Mr. Samuel Whitaker for one of the most important offices in the United States. Complete silence filled the hall. The wealthy bidder who had mocked the chair only moments earlier slowly turned back toward the simple oak seat. Samuel gently picked up his weathered wooden toolbox. As he lifted it, one of the old brass latches unexpectedly slipped open. Inside rested carefully folded woodworking plans drawn entirely by hand, several beautifully worn chisels whose handles had become smooth through decades of use, and a single sealed envelope written in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. For Samuel, open this when people finally understand that the value of fine craftsmanship is measured by the lives it quietly serves, not by the price someone is willing to pay for it. The auction hall remained completely silent as Elizabeth Morgan walked toward the simple oak chair and rested one hand gently on its worn backrest. Most people see scratches, she said. Our historians see history. She smiled before turning toward the audience. More than 52 years ago, this chair stood inside a private study used by the President of the United States. A wave of surprised whispers spread across the room. The wealthy bidder who had dismissed it only minutes earlier stared at the modest piece of furniture in disbelief. That chair? He asked quietly. Elizabeth nodded. That very chair. She invited Samuel Whitaker to join her beside the display. Samuel walked slowly across the hall, carrying his weathered wooden toolbox. He placed it carefully on the floor before gently running his fingertips along one of the chair's armrests. I remember this piece of wood, he said softly. It came from an old white oak that had stood through storms for nearly a century. Several visitors leaned closer to listen. Elizabeth continued. When the presidential residence commissioned a craftsman to build a chair for the president's private reading room, they weren't looking for the most famous furniture maker. She smiled toward Samuel. They were looking for someone whose work was known for lasting generations. One young woodworking student raised his hand. Why does it look so simple? Samuel smiled warmly. Because the person sitting in it was supposed to notice the book in his hands. He gently touched the smooth armrest, not the chair beneath him. The audience became quiet again. Elizabeth carefully lifted a large black and white photograph from the display. It showed a much younger Samuel standing in a woodworking shop beside the finished chair before it was delivered. Another photograph showed the chair positioned beside a fireplace in the presidential reading room. Every mark on this chair tells a story, Elizabeth explained. She pointed toward the polished armrests. These became smooth because they were used almost every evening. She indicated a tiny dent near one leg. That appeared when a family dog knocked over a side table. Soft laughter echoed through the hall. Samuel nodded. I offered to repair it. He smiled. The president told me to leave it exactly as it was. Curious visitors gathered even closer. One collector asked, Didn't you want people to remember your name? Samuel gently shook his head. No. He looked around the room. I wanted them to remember that the chair never failed the person who depended on it. Elizabeth smiled knowingly. That's why museums preserve his work. Samuel slowly opened his weathered wooden toolbox. Inside rested dozens of hand-drawn furniture plans, dating back more than 60 years. None of them carried signatures or elaborate titles. Instead, each drawing simply listed the name of the person for whom the furniture had been built. School teacher, local librarian, veterans hospital, children's reading room. A young craftsman looked surprised. You named the furniture after the people who used it? Samuel nodded. Furniture should remember its owner. He smiled softly, not its maker. The hall fell silent once more. Elizabeth carefully unfolded another set of woodworking plans. At the top, written neatly in pencil, were only 4 words. President's Reading Chair Final Design. Beneath the drawings, however, someone had written a handwritten note in blue ink decades earlier. Build it strong enough that no one will ever have to think about it while they are sitting there making difficult decisions. Several museum curators quietly exchanged glances. That single sentence explained more about Samuel Whitaker's philosophy than any award or title ever could. As Samuel carefully returned the plans to the toolbox, Another small leather envelope became visible beneath them. Written across its front in the same elegant blue handwriting were only a few words. For the day, people finally discover that the greatest craftsman is the one whose work becomes so dependable that history forgets it was ever built by human hands. The auction hall remained completely silent as Samuel Whitaker carefully closed the lid of his weathered wooden toolbox. Around him, collectors who had dismissed the chair only minutes earlier now examined it with entirely different eyes. They were no longer searching for flawless wood or perfect polish. They were searching for the story hidden inside every worn surface. Elizabeth Morgan slowly walked around the chair before pointing toward the smooth right armrest. "Many visitors have asked why we never restored this section," she said. "The answer is simple." She smiled gently. "Because this isn't damage." Samuel nodded. "That's 40 years of careful reading." A young furniture conservator looked puzzled. Samuel rested one hand on the chair. When someone spends years sitting in the same place, wood slowly begins remembering them. The room became quiet. Elizabeth carefully lifted another photograph from the display. It showed the president sitting in the chair late at night, surrounded by stacks of papers, handwritten notes, and history books. "This picture was taken long after everyone else had gone home," she explained. "Many of the nation's most difficult decisions were considered while sitting in this very chair." One university history student quietly asked, "Did you ever imagine something you built would become part of history?" Samuel smiled softly. "No." He looked at the chair for a long moment. "I only hoped it would be comfortable enough that the person sitting in it could focus on the work instead of the furniture." Gentle laughter echoed through the hall. Samuel continued, "A craftsman should solve problems quietly." Elizabeth nodded before pointing toward a small repaired crack beneath the seat. "Most people never notice this." Samuel chuckled. "Neither did the president." Curious visitors leaned closer. "About 15 years after I delivered the chair," Samuel explained, "I received a letter asking whether I could inspect it." He smiled. One support rail had begun to loosen after decades of daily use. A collector asked, "Did you replace the damaged part?" Samuel gently shook his head. "No." He smiled. The original wood had earned the right to stay. Instead, he reinforced the chair from the inside, using a hidden joint that could never be seen without turning the chair upside down. Elizabeth added, "Museum experts later described it as one of the finest invisible structural repairs they had ever examined." Samuel looked slightly embarrassed. "The strongest repair," he said quietly, "is the one nobody notices." Several young woodworkers immediately wrote the sentence into their notebooks. Elizabeth then walked toward a nearby display containing official documents from the presidential archives. She carefully removed a faded, handwritten letter preserved beneath glass. "This," she said, "arrived at Samuel's workshop shortly after the repair was completed." She handed the letter to Samuel, who adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, thank you for repairing the chair exactly as you built it, with honesty instead of shortcuts. Some things deserve to grow old with dignity rather than appear new again." The hall became completely silent. Samuel carefully folded the letter before placing it back inside the display case. "That sentence," he said softly, "changed the way I built every piece of furniture afterward." As he reached into the toolbox once more, a small cloth bundle slipped loose from beneath the woodworking plans. Inside rested the original hand-carved marking gauge. His own master cabinet maker had given him more than 60 years earlier. Tucked beneath the tool lay the same sealed envelope written in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. "For Samuel. Open this when people finally understand that a true craftsman never builds furniture to survive time. He builds it to serve people faithfully while time quietly passes." The auction hall remained perfectly still as Samuel Whitaker carefully picked up the final sealed envelope from inside his weathered wooden toolbox. The paper had yellowed with age, but the elegant blue handwriting remained beautifully preserved. Samuel adjusted his round glasses, gently broke the old wax seal, and unfolded the letter. Every collector, curator, historian, and craftsman watched in complete silence. "Dear Samuel," he began reading softly, "if you are opening this letter, then people have finally discovered your work. I hope they never become more interested in the craftsman than in the purpose of the craft." He paused before continuing. "Many woodworkers spend their lives trying to build furniture that attracts attention. Build furniture that gives attention instead. A well-made chair should disappear beneath the person using it, allowing comfort, peace, and thought to remain." The room remained silent. Samuel unfolded the second page. One day, wealthy collectors may compete to own your work. Museums may place it behind glass. Historians may write about it. Never mistake admiration for purpose. Wood exists to serve. The craftsman exists to help wood serve well. Several young furniture makers quietly lowered their eyes. Samuel smiled gently before reading on. Do not fear scratches, worn edges, or faded finishes. Those are not signs that your work is becoming weaker. They are proof that someone trusted it long enough to let life happen upon it. Many visitors instinctively looked back toward the worn armrests of the old oak chair. Samuel carefully unfolded the final page. If anyone ever asks you what makes a masterpiece, do not show them your finest carving. Show them the piece that quietly fulfilled its purpose every single day, without asking for recognition. Beauty impresses people. Faithfulness serves them. Samuel slowly folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, Elizabeth Morgan stepped forward with a smile. "Mr. Whitaker," she said softly. "Today people thought they were attending an auction." She looked around the hall. "They're leaving with a lesson about craftsmanship." Samuel gently shook his head. "No." He smiled toward the old chair. "They're leaving with a lesson about responsibility." Elizabeth laughed quietly. "That sounds exactly like something your teacher would have said." At that moment, the lights in the exhibition hall dimmed as a large curtain quietly opened beside the auction stage. Behind it stood a permanent museum display prepared without Samuel's knowledge. Inside, a beautifully crafted glass case rested his faded flannel shirt, worn denim overalls, leather work boots, weathered wooden toolbox, hand-drawn woodworking plans, original carving tools, the president's handwritten thank you letter, the old marking gauge from his teacher, and the three-legged workshop stool on which Samuel had spent more than half a century shaping wood by hand. Above the display stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Samuel Whitaker Heritage of Craftsmanship," dedicated to the master woodworker who proved that the greatest furniture is not remembered because it is beautiful, but because it faithfully served generations without ever asking to be admired. The audience slowly rose together in a standing ovation. Some applauded the remarkable chair built for a president. Others applauded the extraordinary skill of a master craftsman. But those who truly understood what they had witnessed that afternoon realized they were honoring something far greater than a historic piece of furniture. They were honoring a man who had spent an entire lifetime proving that the finest work any craftsperson can create is not something that draws attention to itself, but something that quietly makes life better for everyone who depends upon it. The story of Samuel Whitaker quickly spread throughout the woodworking community. Historical preservation societies, museums, and craft schools across the United States. At first, newspapers focused on the remarkable auction where a worn wooden chair dismissed as nearly worthless turned out to be the handcrafted presidential chair built by an unknown master craftsman more than half a century earlier. But as people learned Samuel's story, the event became far more than the rediscovery of an important historical artifact. It became a lesson about humility, dedication, and the quiet purpose of true craftsmanship. 1 year later, the American Guild of Master Woodworkers invited Samuel to deliver the opening address at its national conference. Hundreds of cabinet makers, furniture designers, restoration specialists, apprentices, museum conservators, and woodworking instructors filled the auditorium expecting a lecture on joinery, carving techniques, or historical furniture restoration. Instead, Samuel walked onto the stage carrying only his weathered wooden toolbox. He slowly opened it and removed the oldest of his hand-drawn woodworking plans. Looking across the silent audience, he smiled gently before reading the first sentence written in the corner of the drawing more than 50 years earlier. "Build something that will still deserve to exist after you no longer do." He quietly rolled the drawing closed again. "People often ask me what the finest piece of furniture I ever built was," he began. "The truth is," he smiled softly, "it wasn't the chair built for a president." The audience listened without moving. "The finest piece I ever built was the one that helped someone's ordinary day become a little easier." Complete silence filled the hall. Samuel continued, "The greatest mistake young craftsmen make is believing they are shaping wood." He rested one hand on the old toolbox. "They're not." Looking around the room, he smiled. "They're shaping the moments people will live around it." Elizabeth Morgan, seated in the front row, quietly smiled as those words reminded her of the afternoon when an elderly carpenter had transformed an ordinary auction into a lesson that no woodworking school could ever fully teach. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the American Guild unveiled the Samuel Whitaker Center for Traditional Craftsmanship, established to preserve the philosophy that had guided his life's work. Inside the center rested Samuel's faded flannel shirt, worn denim overalls, leather work boots, weathered wooden toolbox, original woodworking plans, carving tools, the president's thank you letter, the old marking gauge from his teacher, and the famous oak chair that had quietly become one of the country's most meaningful historical artifacts. Visitors expected the first gallery to display elaborate carvings, priceless antiques, and championship furniture. Instead, they found a single handwritten question displayed beneath soft lighting: "Will someone live better because you built this?" Every apprentice entering the center was asked to stand before that question before touching a single piece of wood. Years later, after Samuel Whitaker peacefully passed away at the age of 94, master craftsmen, apprentices, museum conservators, historians, and furniture makers from around the world gathered to honor him. There were no competitions, no awards for craftsmanship, and no discussions about market value. Instead, one by one, they quietly placed their oldest woodworking tools beside Samuel's portrait, promising to build furniture worthy not of admiration, but of trust. Above the entrance to the Samuel Whitaker Center for Traditional Craftsmanship, a bronze inscription welcomed every future craftsman with the words that would forever define his legacy: "A masterpiece is not the piece people admire the most. It is the one they depend on the longest." Those who visited the center often admired the old oak chair, the weathered toolbox, and the worn carving tools that had shaped a lifetime of honest work. But those who truly understood Samuel Whitaker's life realized that his greatest accomplishment had never been building furniture for a president. It was teaching generations of craftsmen that the highest form of artistry is not creating something people cannot stop looking at. It is creating something so dependable that people can stop thinking about it altogether. The story of Samuel Whitaker soon spread far beyond the auction hall in Williamsburg. At first, newspapers focused on the astonishing moment when an old wooden chair that many people had dismissed as nearly worthless was revealed to have been handcrafted for a president of the United States. But as historians, museum curators, furniture makers, and ordinary families learned who Samuel Whitaker truly was, the story became far more than the rediscovery of a valuable historical artifact. It became a reminder that the finest craftsmanship is rarely measured by how beautiful it appears, but by how faithfully it serves, generation after generation. In the years that followed, woodworking schools, museums, restoration workshops, and trade academies invited Samuel to speak. Many expected him to explain advanced joinery, carving techniques, or the secrets behind furniture that could last for decades. Instead, he would quietly place a simple block of unfinished oak on the table and ask one question: "What kind of life will this piece of wood become part of?" The room would always fall silent. "If you cannot answer that," he would continue gently, "then you're building furniture for yourself, not for the person who will depend on it." During his final public appearance, Samuel entered the National Heritage Museum carrying the same weathered wooden toolbox that had followed him through more than 60 years of honest work. Instead of walking toward the famous presidential chair displayed behind glass, he stopped beside a plain wooden bench he had quietly repaired for the museum years earlier, without ever signing his name. He rested one hand on the bench and smiled. "More people have sat here than in the president's chair," he said softly. Several museum visitors looked surprised. Samuel chuckled, "And that's exactly why I'm just as proud of it." The room filled with gentle laughter. He slowly closed the lid of his toolbox. "A craftsman should never ask," he said, "whether people will remember who built the furniture." He looked around the gallery. He should ask whether the furniture remembered how to take care of the people. Those became the final public words he ever shared. Years after Samuel Whitaker peacefully passed away, visitors continued stopping before the old oak chair that had once belonged to a president. Yet many of them spent just as much time looking at the simple wooden bench displayed beside it, after reading the small plaque explaining that its maker believed every piece of honest work deserved the same care, whether it stood inside the White House or beside the entrance of a museum. Above both pieces hung a simple bronze inscription: "The greatest craftsman is not remembered because of the importance of the person who used his work. He is remembered because every person who used his work felt equally important." Visitors often admired the chair that had become part of American history. But those who truly understood Samuel Whitaker's life realized that the chair was never the real masterpiece. The masterpiece was the quiet philosophy that guided every piece of wood he ever touched, that true craftsmanship is an act of service, and the most valuable things we create are often the ones that make other people's lives better, without ever asking to be noticed.